That is kind of what we talked about in here last week. We talked about some wild, crazy dreams that God gave to this prophet named Daniel in the Old Testament about huge statues and wild creatures like four-headed leopards and lions with wings. And ultimately, those things were symbolic and representative of the way that countries and kingdoms and kings and leaders around the world tend to act wild and ferocious, kind of like these beasts. And that's an image that you'll read about throughout the Bible, are these creatures or animals or beasts, even toward the end of the Bible. And oftentimes these beasts represent more than just some crazy fictional creature. They represent people, groups of people, leaders of people, countries of people, and the ways that they treat and mistreat each other. And so that's a theme that we're going to look at today as we continue on in some things that Jesus says. We've been trekking through Matthew's gospel, if you haven't been with us. And in Matthew's gospel, he's telling us about the life and times of Jesus Christ, specifically how he believes Jesus is this promised coming king that the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew scriptures have predicted for centuries and centuries would come. And Matthew believes he is this ultimate king, even this forever king. And Matthew even calls him one step more. He calls him Emmanuel, which means God with us. And so he thinks even more about Jesus than him being a good prophet or a good leader or religious figure or example. He thinks of him as God in the flesh. And Jesus is having these final conversations again, just days before his betrayal, his death, his resurrection. That's where we're at in the life of Jesus, just a few days prior to that. And he's having these intimate conversations at this point in time with some of his closest followers on the Mount of Olives, right across from the city of Jerusalem. If you visit there today, it's about a 1.5 mile walk to the east of Jerusalem, and they're sitting down under some olive trees perhaps and talking about these things, having these conversations. And so that was what we talked about last week, this comparison of kings and kingdoms to creatures and wild animals that are untamable. And so as we walk into our discussion today, just keep that filed at the back of your mind. And just a little bit of review as well. The way that this conversation started out was Jesus made 3 specific statements. He said, I'm going to send you, and he was talking to the leaders of Jerusalem at that point in time, who were pretending to be very religious, very committed to justice and all those things, but they were doing anything but it. They were ignoring God's instructions. Jesus said, I'm going to send you some representatives. And you're going to kill some of them, and you're going to mistreat other ones, and you're going to drive other ones away from the synagogues and away from their homes and out of your city. So you're going to mistreat my representatives. And then he tells some of the leaders in Jerusalem, I'm not coming back to the temple grounds for a long time. When I do, you're going to have a change of heart. You're going to see me differently. And then he also says there's going to come a time when this building called the temple in Jerusalem, it's going to be dismantled stone by stone. It's going to be destroyed by something. And so his followers, after that conversation, they say, first of all, when are these things going to happen? We talked about that a couple weeks ago. Jesus, instead of giving him a precise answer, he just talks about all these different cycles. He says, well, until these things happen, there's going to be people that claim to rule on God's behalf. There's going to be lots of fighting and wars and conflicts, and different cultures will start clashing, and governments will clash, and there's going to be all these natural disasters, and you're just going to see these cycles, one thing after the next for some period of time. That's how he answers the beginning of their question of when. But they ask a second question. They say, what is going to be the sign of your coming, when you're going to come back here and people's hearts are going to be different, and of the end of the age? And end of the age, it sounds very kind of ambiguous out there, but what it's really talking about, end of the age just means the completion of the time period. So until all these things happen, until you return, until the buildings of this temple complex are pulled apart, until people stop chasing your representatives around trying to kill them and hurt them and force them out of their cities and towns, like what's going to be the sign that these things are finally done or about ready to be done? And Jesus is going to give him an answer. This is kind of interactive some weeks, and so I want to ask you a question. If you consider yourself a little bit familiar with the Bible uses the word sign a lot of different times. How would you define that? What do you think a sign is in terms of the Bible? I mean, here it's like, a stop sign on the side of the road, but how do you think Jesus means that? And how do you think his followers mean it when they say, what's going to be the sign of this?
Something's going to happen.
Something's going to happen, okay? Yeah, like some event or maybe physical thing that you see in nature. Something's going to happen. It's going to be an indicator, right? That these things are about to happen or that they're in the mix. They're in the works. There's going to be something that calls our attention to it. And the word sign's been used a lot of times before. Let me ask this question. What was the sign that Jesus had arrived the first time? That God had sent a Savior into the world. What was the sign?
The star.
Okay, there was a star. Sure, that was a sign. What was another sign?
Three magi.
3 magi, okay. And you actually can find different prophecies in the Old Testament where it predicts these kings or magi coming from the east at some point in time to worship God's anointed one, his king, his Messiah. What was the sign? Yeah.
As a child, he spoke as adult people.
Okay, when he was 12 years old, he was sitting having these really intense conversations with some of the religious leaders. Sure. Any other signs you can think of? John the Baptist, okay. He was kind of like supposed to be a forerunner in the spirit of Elijah coming. I'm thinking of something super basic. Think about the Christmas story and something that you might display in your home. What did he tell? Well, there are angels, definitely. What was the sign to the shepherds? Now, the star was to the Magi, right? But to the shepherds, what? The angels were a sign, but what did they tell them? How did they tell them they would know where Jesus would be? Yeah, they're going to find this kid in a feeding trough, in a manger, right? That's how you'll know. And so that was one of the signs too. So these different signs are indicators of Jesus' first arrival. And so Jesus says in the same way, you're going to see a sign that's going to indicate these other questions that you've been asking me about. You're going to see it. And the logical question is, well, Jesus, what is the sign? He's actually going to give us about 4 different signs. We're going to talk about the first one this morning because it's something he develops more. And he starts to answer this in verse 15 of Matthew chapter 24. He says, then, as soon as you see and he uses this phrase, he calls the sign the abomination of desolation, which sounds pretty vague, but we'll step into that in a moment, spoken by the prophet Daniel. When you see this abomination of desolation that the prophet Daniel spoke about, some of the stuff that Daniel was dreaming about, when you see that thing, just like you saw the manger, you saw John the Baptist, or you saw the Magi coming in, or you saw the star in the sky, that's going to be an indicator of something when you see that. So the question is, what is the abomination of desolation? What is Jesus talking about? That word literally means either the scary thing or the disgusting thing that destroys stuff. And if you plug it into the context of Daniel's dreams that we've been talking about, what are the scary things that Daniel's been dreaming about? What are these creatures he's been dreaming about? What are they? Nations and rulers, right? That's the scary thing. And so perhaps this abomination of desolation or this scary or disgusting thing that just wreaks havoc and destruction, maybe it's one of those nations that Daniel's been dreaming about or something similar, or some leader, and they're going to act just like the creatures and the wild beasts that these other nations that Daniel dreamed about acted like as well. But that's going to be something that's going to be an indicator. Again, just a little review on Daniel. His dreams have been that nations and their leaders are wild and devastating beasts. And maybe even these are things that are cyclical in history. Maybe we can think of nations or leaders in our time that have acted like wild beasts. Maybe you can flip on the news or open an app right now and see that exhibited. Maybe it's been our own nation at times that has acted like a wild beast. Maybe it's been other nations in history, recent history or past history or ancient history that have acted these ways. Secondly, Daniel, back in his book, when he talks about desolation, that's a term that pops up. And so when Jesus uses it, it's activating those other previous references, specifically the ones that Daniel referred to. And when Daniel talks about a desolation, it's usually some sort of destruction and a dishonoring of Jerusalem and or the temple in Jerusalem. That's what a desolation is considered. It's havoc being wreaked on Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem, and maybe the city or the religious leaders or the worship system somehow being dishonored by whoever's causing that. That's a desolation. And Daniel actually talks about multiple desolations. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, but can any of you think about one of the desolations Daniel talks about, where Jerusalem and the temple is destroyed or havoc is wreaked on it? Can any of you think about any times that might have been discussed or might have happened throughout history that way. Okay. Okay, yeah, that's one reference. So there was this guy who came about through the Greek Empire eventually, about 170 years before the time of Jesus' birth. His name is Antiochus, and he was part of the Greek Empire called the Seleucid Empire. And he came in and sprinkled pig's blood all over the temple and stopped the sacrificial system for 3.5 years and all these things. And so it seems like that's one of the things that Daniel was speaking about, perhaps in chapter 11 of Daniel. Those events seem to describe some of what would happen there. That's one of them. Another one was when the Empire of Babylon came in and wreaked havoc. They actually destroyed the first temple, and they deported a lot of people living in Jerusalem into Babylon, including Daniel. He was carted off in the first wave of that. And so that was something happening in his lifetime, and it lasted for about 70 years. And so that was one of those instances as well where Jerusalem was laid desolate. There's another one that the book of Daniel describes, and it would happen, according to the book of Daniel, sometime after this Messiah figure, this king, this ruler, this even God, predicted in the Old Testament after his death. And that's something that a lot of Jewish people would have found confusing or just maybe disagreed with even. But supposedly there would be another desolation after the point of the death of this Messiah that was spoken of. And then even at the end of Daniel, there's a desolation that's spoken of near a time when many people would be resurrected from the dead. So these are kind of intriguing, and some of them may have happened, and some of them may have not yet happened because of the descriptions of them. But there are these layers of desolation, so to speak. Think about it in terms of a mountain. If you look out here, out the window to the west, which mountain do you see? The Pine Mountain Range, right? But if you look before that, there's foothills. You'll see foothills on the edge, maybe where Oak Grove Campground is. Or if you're a little bit further up north, you'll see the Red Cliffs Desert Preserve. But if you look head on, you'll see Pine Mountain. But in front of it are all these different layers of foothills. Those are mountains as well, but they lead up to it. And if you looked from the side, you could see the differentiation. You could see maybe the smaller foothills, and then the larger foothills, and some of the cliffs, and then finally Pine Mountain, which is over 10,000 feet high. But looking straight on, it's hard to kind of distinguish where those different points are. In the same way, these prophets in the Old Testament, they describe different events, and some of them are events that happen in patterns, very similar ones, but maybe they lead up to or they build up to some ultimate greater event. And maybe that's one way to even think about this abomination of desolation or these desolations. They've happened before, maybe they'll happen again, and maybe they'll ultimately happen in a grandiose way, perhaps. Maybe that's what we're seeing here as well. Another thing that we see from Daniel is the nation or the leader who carries out each of these desolations every time they overthrow Jerusalem or attack the temple or dishonor the temple with pig's blood or anything like that, that person is called the disgusting thing, or that country that attacks is called the disgusting thing or the scary thing or the abomination. So the person who instigates it is the abomination, and the desolation is what happens, what is experienced. And Jesus goes on, he says, when you see this abomination of desolation, this ruin that's caused by some leader or some nation or nation state or coalition or whatever, some government figure, when you see them standing or set up in the holy place, the holy place is just a phrase, and it's used to describe the location of the temple in Jerusalem. So now if we set apart the holy place in Jerusalem now, it'd probably be the Temple Mount, right? The area around the temple where it used to exist. If we were back in the time of Jesus, it would be the temple building and its structures. If we were 500 years from now in the future, who knows what it would look like. It would be that place associated with Jerusalem and where the location of the temple had been or will be or was, something like that, or is. That's the holy place. So when you see this thing coming in, this nation or this ruler coming in to lay havoc to Jerusalem and to the holy place, Matthew says, let the reader understand. So Matthew's looking forward and he's saying, I don't know at the time I'm writing this that these things that Jesus is talking about, that this answer, this sign that we've been waiting for has actually happened yet. Jesus says, if you see it though, then the people in Judea, they must flee to the mountains. And so whatever this sign is, it seems to be related to some animal-like country or leader or both coming in to again start another desolation in Jerusalem. If you see that, the sign is meant to drive a response. It's a command verb. It says, get out of town, basically. And the idea is flee to the mountains and don't take anything with you. If you think you see a nation or a leader approaching to dishonor or destroy the temple or the city of Jerusalem, and you happen to be living in Judea, then you need to escape. And that seems logical, right? Seems like something that could apply to any point in time throughout history, right? Any kind of an attack, and maybe even far beyond Jerusalem. If you're living in a country or a place today and you see an enemy army or leader who's about to wreak havoc and dishonor or destroy the place that you're living, it might be wise to flee at that point in time as well. I think about within the last, 48 hours, there was actually a military operation in northern Azerbaijan because there's a lot of Armenian people that were living in an area that was kind of separated from the main government. And Azerbaijan let this go on for, I think, a couple of decades without really dealing with it. And then within the last 48 hours, they decided, we're going to deal with this. And so they put their military into it, and within 24 hours, they had control of this kind of separated region with a lot of Armenian people. And the response to that was that the government of Armenia has opened the doors and said, if you're Armenian, we suggest that you come across the border back into Armenia, because a lot of people are fearing ethnic cleansing or reprisal against them because they've kind of been a rebellious area of Azerbaijan for a couple decades. And so they're saying, here's an opportunity, flee, get out before something major happens. So maybe we see these same types of events happening even in our world today. But there's supposed to be response. And Jesus clarifies that response a little further. He says, a man on the housetop, a human on the housetop must not come down to get things out of his house. And a person in the field must not go back to get his or her coat. So just like if it were a house fire and you go back in, you're putting yourself at risk. If you're a resident of Judea, you'll need to flee to survive if you see something like this happening. He also says in verse 19, woe to pregnant women and nursing moms in those days. How do you think a desolation kind of event like we've described, what additional challenges do you think it might present to someone who is pregnant or nursing as a mom? What do you think? Mobility? Yeah, it's hard to get up and move fast when you've got a young child with you, huh? Or when you're maybe 8 or 9 months pregnant, right?
Famine.
What?
Famine.
Famine. How would famine affect things?
Not enough food.
Yeah, not enough food. And as a mom, you're already trying to eat for a couple, right? Because you're the food source, whether the baby's inside of you or outside of you, right? And so famine's going to wreak even more havoc. And then with an infant, you're going to see that effects on someone that's so close and so dear to you, not just on yourself, right? There's going to be a lot of emotional strain that happens as well. And it was common, especially in times of cities besieging other cities or nations besieging cities, for starvation to happen for months without food. And a child's life would probably not last in the face of something like that. So they're going to face possibly additional grief because of the circumstances of food shortages, etc. Jesus says, pray that your escape may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. So winter obviously is a season. The Sabbath could be a Saturday when you're just supposed to focus on worship, or it could be a special feast day or festival. How do you think that would complicate things in the event of maybe an attack? Why would it be worse on a Sabbath or in the winter? Okay, yeah. If this happens on a Sabbath, one, maybe you're gathered religiously, right? At church buildings like this or synagogues at this point in time. So maybe lots of people are gathered. Or if it's on a festival or a feast or religious holiday when these things happen, there could be hundreds of thousands of people in Jerusalem, more than normal when something like this happens. And they thought the population could expand between 600,000 and 1 million people for the Passover feast. That many people would travel into Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. So can you imagine if something like this came upon Jerusalem when it was a special season or occasion, how many more people would be affected by it? That's what he says. And I want to pose this question. It'll probably be one of the last questions we talk about collectively today, but has anything like what Jesus seems to be describing, again, this is at the point 2 days before his betrayal and arrest and crucifixion on the cross. Since that point in time when Jesus had this conversation with his followers, has anything in history like what we've been describing occurred? Okay, well, the Holocaust certainly was something where it's a massive desolation, and the Jewish people were a big part of the target of that. Sure, definitely. Anything else in history that you can think of? Yes?
Floods and volcanoes.
Okay, floods and volcanoes. There have been, desolating events on different cultures and societies. Anything surrounding Jerusalem specifically since that point in time? Are the buildings that were there in the time of Jesus on the Temple Mount still there today? Why not?
Well, that devastation in 70 AD, that wiped.
Yeah, right. That's right. So in 70 AD, the Roman army came in and they brought about another desolation. And they were yet another example of an abomination, of this scary or disgusting thing that came in, and they burnt most of the temple. They pulled blocks from blocks, and these blocks were huge. Some of them weighed, multiple tons. And they completely ripped apart most of the temple complex. They only left 3 towers, I think, that were part of the more of the palace of Herod at the time standing. Everything else was ripped apart, which is why we have such devastation and nothing left of that temple complex still today, even though you have the wall that was the support wall around it for the base of it still standing. Because something did happen similar to that. There was a rebellion, and it had been kind of brewing for years, and in 66 AD, it really started to kick off, and the Jewish people were pushing more and more back against the Roman Empire. And there was a not-so-great Roman emperor in power in 66. His name was Nero. And if you've heard anything about Nero, he was infamous for, one, being slightly psychotic, secondly, for persecuting Christians and for the combat, gladiators and arena-style games and things like that just made a mockery of human life. And so he was in power at that point in time, and he dispatched one of his best generals, Vespasian, there to oversee the Jewish revolt and to suppress it. So he suppressed it and installed some kind of temporary government figures and went back to Rome, and he put his son Titus, who was also a military commander, in charge of things in Jerusalem. In the meantime, Nero died, and Vespasian, the general who oversaw that, was promoted to emperor over Rome. And his son Titus was the chief commander of all the Roman armies. And so it was Titus' responsibility to maintain order. And the Jews again rebelled against the kind of government that Rome had temporarily set up. And so Titus came in with a pretty heavy hand in the Roman army and just decimated things in Jerusalem. He chose to do this 3 days before the Passover feast in 70 CE or AD, however you term it. And so that's the time of the year when there's an influx of, again, 600,000 to 1 million people into Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And he besieged the city. He surrounded it, and over several months forced it into a state of starvation, massive unrest. There was murder, there was famine, there was cannibalism happening within the city because of the extreme pressure of that many people being trapped in the city, or a good number of them, and the time that it happened. And finally, on August 30th, about 4 months later, the Roman forces overwhelmed the city and took the final walls and came in, burned the temple complex, destroyed some houses of the high priests and other things in the city of Jerusalem. And so another abomination of desolation happened again. Jesus said in verse 21, "For at that time there will be great distress." Whenever this abomination of desolation comes in, there'll be great distress. But then he says something that seems to go even further than what was experienced in 70 AD. He says, "The kind that hasn't taken place from the beginning of the world until now, and never will again." And those are strong terms. He says, this desolation, the one that I foresee, the one that's going to be an indicator of the temple being destroyed in Jerusalem, the one that's going to be an indicator of me coming back to the temple area, the one that's going to be an indicator of the time is about to end when my servants will stop being chased and harmed around the world. He says, this sign that you're looking for, it's going to be kind of unlike anything that the created order, it's literally the word cosmos, has ever experienced. There's a couple options here. One is Jesus being poetic. He's using highly poetic language, which a lot of the prophets did, which is a possibility. Another possibility is that Jesus is describing multiple events that are parallel events. Maybe Jesus is looking out and he's seeing that mountain. And in the front, there's some foothills. There's this destruction that Rome is going to wreck, 40 years later in 70 AD, and it's going to be another desolation. And then maybe he's looking out in the future and he sees some more pronounced foothills that lead up to a bigger mountain. And then maybe there's that final mountain in the distance, which is something even greater in scale. And maybe the desolation's even greater in scale. And so maybe Jesus is being more literal here with this than he is poetic. Maybe there really is a time that Jesus foresees when there's going to be a desolation unlike something that the created world has ever experienced before. And Jesus says, finally, unless those days were cut short, nobody would be saved or rescued. But those days will be cut short because of the elect or because of the chosen. So when this desolation happens, unless it were shortened, nobody would be rescued. But because I have some people that I've chosen, the days will be shortened. Does that apply to the time when Rome came and besieged Jerusalem in 70 AD? Maybe. Does it apply to something still further out in the future that's unlike anything the world's ever experienced? Perhaps. But God has, again, humanity at heart. So we're going to talk about more signs, the 3 other signs that Jesus says will indicate that these questions, these circumstances that his followers have asked about are about to come to an end, that time is about to come to an end. We'll look at that next week. I just want to leave you with this thought as we close, though. It seems like, and I'll get your question too, it seems like the Bible's headed somewhere. And if you open up page 1 and 2 of Genesis, you see this amazing kingdom that God creates, this beautiful world where everything is good, and even humanity that God makes in his own image, and he gives a commission to be fruitful and multiply and to rule over the earth and the other creatures that he's created on it, to bring about more potential out of this world that he's created, to better order it and organize it as he's already done, and to make it a more and more fruitful world. And it seems like if you flip to the end of the Bible, God's headed there ultimately. But where we are right now is certainly not there. And there's going to be something that happens to get us there. And perhaps that's what Jesus is trying to describe to us. Part of the journey to bring us from where we are now to where he ultimately will take things in the end, to restore things to even a better state than they used to be, to unite heaven and earth, to bring about a victory over death, and all these things that this passage talks about as well. And so I know some of this seems vague and some of it seems ambiguous, but the desolations are the things that we're experiencing because people and nations and leaders are the ways that they are. It's something that Jerusalem has and will continue to experience, but it's something that's headed somewhere. And it seems like there is some ultimate event, perhaps some unparalleled event, that will ultimately bring about something much greater and more beautiful than anything we've ever seen. So let's close there today.